Sound check Webex.
Oleg.
Salut Julie.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I
Yes,
can
we
hear
hear
you.
you fine. This is the video conference team technician. We hear you fine.
Oh.
We are testing
good.
with the room because it was busy. We just connected it.
Yeah.
Stand by.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sure. As long as you can hear me and you can see me.
Yes, we
Excellent.
can hear you.
Yes, good.
Uh,
I hear from your side, I hear sometimes an echo, but maybe.
Yeah, we know why.
Okay.
Oleg, tu as ton microphone de laptop ouvert et tu parles du même bureau. C'est pour ça qu'il y a un écho. Il faut faire attention.
Attends. Je vais vérifier.
Il y a un écho là.
Non, non, pas l'heure. Je vais noter.
Ferme le microphone du laptop et fais le test avec l'autre. Et mets le sound à 0 sur ton laptop.
Voilà, c'est normal maintenant, c'est bon. Il y avait le deuxième laptop qui était allumé. Voilà, est-ce que tu m'entends bien donc?
Ouais, c'est super.
Tu peux faire le share screen vite fait juste pour voir.
Oui, mais là, tu testes de la salle ou tu testes de
Je
ton
parle
laptop?
de Webex, mais je peux, si tu veux, je peux parler
Ah
de.
oui, mais il faut la salle, il ne faut pas le WebEx.
Sans problème.
Merci.
Est-ce que tu m'entends? Ça, c'est
Ouais.
la salle.
Super.
Voilà. Donc, share
Je veux que tu
screen.
fasses un petit share.
Oui.
OK. One moment.
C'est bon, ça fonctionne. Merci.
Oleg,
Dis-moi.
si le client il est là, tu lui dis qu'on on a commencé le stream. Hein, s'il est à côté de toi. Ou tu lui dis que le stream a été lancé vers YouTube.
Mais je crois il attend toi, oui. Tu peux dire, voilà, donc c'est dans la salle. Voilà. Donc, je vais descendre, sauf que je n'ai pas envie
OK, merci.
descendre de la cabine, voilà, donc, parce qu'ils vont en train de commencer. Je vais lancer la vidéo déjà. Enregistrement. Voilà. Merci,
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Please take your seats as we will be starting right now. On behalf of the co-organizers, Raoul Wallenberg Institute, Human Rights Research League, and our co-sponsor, World Organization Against Torture, I welcome you all to today's panel discussion, which is dedicated to the launch and presentation of a comprehensive study and research report that provides an assessment of accountability options for human rights violations in Afghanistan, done by the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. It's wonderful to have you all here, whether in person or joining us online on the WebEx, for what promises to be a very thought-provoking and insightful discussion. To briefly set the stage, I want to provide a short summary on the RWI's Afghanistan program. It was first launched in September 2021 with the support of the Swedish government, beginning only with hosting 3 Afghan research fellows. In 2022, the program expanded to also include the hosting of the UN Special Rapporteur, Mr. Bennett, which happens to also be a visiting professor at the Institute. The program in its current stage, by joining more donors, continues to support the UNSR Bennett's mandate and also promotes research and scholarship leading to better informed strategies to protect human rights and gender equality in Afghanistan. As part of this line of work, strategic studies are conducted to investigate human rights issues that are central to the mandate of the UNSR. The program also supports research fellows, currently 8, organizes academic conferences and roundtables, and also builds resources to train and support the Afghan human rights defenders. Before going to the panelists and questions, I would briefly want to acknowledge all the authors who contributed to this research and study. We had 4 independent consultants, including Dr. Huma Saeed, Mr. Ihsan Qani, Mr. Mehdi Hakimi, and Ms. Orzala Nemat, and 3 of our current research fellows in the Institute, Ms. Kubra Muradi, Dr. Latifa Alawi, and Dr. Harun Rahimi. We are pleased to have 2 of the co-authors with us, one sitting next to me in the room, Ms. Muradi, and also Dr. Huma Saeed online on WebEx. And of course, we are also honored to have UN Special Rapporteur Richard Bennett and the chairman of the Human Rights Research League, Tom Searing, with us here today. Now let's begin our discussion with a question addressed to Dr. Huma Saeed, who is joining us online. She's a prominent human rights expert and also a country advisor at MADRE, an international women's rights organization. Dr. Saeed holds a PhD in criminology and has previously worked with the United Nations and the ICC. Huma, if you could hear us, could you please provide us with an overview of this study, including its methodology and the distinctive features and key findings, particularly focusing on the judicial and formal mechanisms that have been assessed in this report. Thank you, and Huma, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone.
And please use your headsets for the online speaker.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very grateful to be part of this distinguished panel discussing briefly some of the findings of this report. This report examines basically accountability options for Afghanistan violent conflicts since 1978, where grave human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law have occurred, leaving behind an enormous number of war victims and survivors in much destruction on social, political, economic, and cultural levels. The report acknowledges the deteriorating human rights situation, particularly women's rights crisis under the Taliban, but maintains that accountability measures should go beyond addressing just the current human rights and humanitarian crisis. In this context, the report takes the roots of Afghanistan's wars and the historical legacy of severe abuses into account, some of which go back to the 19th century and continues to affect Afghanistan's current human rights crisis. The report, however, recognizes that no single effort in terms of a report can account for the magnitude of the harm done that has affected generations. The report takes a comprehensive approach towards accountability and transitional justice and examines judicial and non-judicial options inside Afghanistan and outside. The report takes a survivor-centered and gender-sensitive approach and examines the impact of conflict through a gender lens. In terms of methodology, the report is based on DISC research, including published reports of the previous documentation of human rights violations, in a limited number of interviews with Afghans inside and outside Afghanistan. These individuals are human rights activists, former government officials, and those engaged in humanitarian and NGO work inside Afghanistan. The report is situated in the broader historical context of Afghanistan, with more focus on the contextual and political developments over the last 4.5 decades, where various phases of violent conflict followed one another without justice and accountability in each phase of political transition. The report has been drafted by a number of Afghan experts, as you already heard from Mr. Furmuli, and who have been working in this field for a long time. With regard to some of the main findings, the report found that during every phase of the conflict in Afghanistan, different armed factions, both Afghan and foreign, and the state actors, committed likely crimes against humanity, war crimes, and serious human rights violations. These have included large-scale massacres and summary executions of tens of thousands of Afghans, indiscriminate bombing and rocketing that killed countless civilians, systematic torture and enforced disappearances, mass rape, and other atrocities. Afghans interviewed for this report all state that all parties bore responsibility, from the PDPA, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, both Khalq and Parcham factions under the Soviet invasion, all Mujahideen groups and the Taliban, as well as foreign actors, including the former USSR, the US, and Pakistani military. As in any other conflict, one challenge is the conflicting narratives about victims and perpetrators of different phases of the conflict. Several participants noted that while one perpetrator may be a hero for one ethnic group, he is a war criminal for another group or groups. Similarly, given that Afghanistan has experienced several political transitions with shifting ideologies, there is the victim-perpetrator dilemma in that someone may have been a perpetrator under one regime while a victim under another, and vice versa. The report addresses developments related to transitional justice efforts in the mid-2000s, where the important document, A Call for Justice, was published, followed by an action plan for peace and reconciliation that proposed specific measures towards justice and accountability. It discusses how failure to implement these measures due to lack of political will by national and international actors led to entrenched impunity in the country. The report has examined the impact of conflict through a gender lens, recognizing that throughout the course of the Afghan conflict since 1978, Afghan women have been utilized as weapons of war. Gender-based crimes and discrimination and violence against women, now heightened in scale under the Taliban, have a long history in Afghanistan under different regimes, including over the last 20 years, where on the one hand, significant progress was made, but on the other, women continue to be victims of sexual and gender-based crimes. Like men, Afghan women have been victims of torture, disappearances, arbitrary killings, but significantly, they've also suffered from sexual and gender-based violence. The report also discusses harmful legacies of conflict, including corruption and land grabbing, as well as environmental harm. With regard to some accountability mechanisms, under international human rights law, Taliban, as the authorities maintaining effective control of the country, has obligation to all international treaties which Afghanistan is a party. The report therefore examines the limited possibilities for accountability under the de facto authorities, including the Taliban's general amnesty, de facto accountability institutions, and military courts. It goes without saying that the de facto authorities who themselves are accused of gross human rights violations cannot be expected to hold perpetrators of alleged crimes against humanity and war crimes accountable. The report therefore examines accountability options outside Afghanistan, focusing on possibilities and limitations. These include international judicial bodies such as the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, regional judicial bodies like the European Court of Human Rights, national United Nations mandates such as the Special Procedure and treaty bodies based on mechanisms, domestic investigations, including those under universal jurisdiction, civil litigation, and indirect accountability methods. A notable part of the report is dedicated to gender justice and accountability for sexual and gender-based crime. Not only does it discuss the impact of conflict on women and girls over decades of violent conflicts, but also accountability options for gender justice, including investigations of the crime of gender persecution at the ICC, codification of gender apartheid as a crime against humanity, bringing a case at the International Court of Justice, and granting humanitarian protection to Afghan women and girls on the grounds that the crime against humanity of gender persecution is being committed against them. The report concludes that given the complexity and multidimensional nature of conflicts in Afghanistan, a diverse but integrated range of accountability mechanisms, both judicial and non-judicial, may provide the most effective strategies to combat impunity and deliver justice. This includes memorialization, documentations, and reparations, among other measures. In terms of some of the main recommendations, the report suggests supporting a UN mandate international investigation and accountability mechanism for past and current human rights violations and abuses by all parties to the conflict in Afghanistan, including for gender persecution and other gender-specific crimes, abuses against ethnic and religious minorities, violations of international humanitarian law, and economic and financial crimes in Afghanistan, including corruption and land grabbing that have contributed to substantial human rights abuses. It proposes supporting the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan, UNAMA documentation of human rights violations, and other national and extraterritorial investigations of war crimes and crimes against humanity. It proposes supporting truth-telling, memorialization, and other non-judicial forms of justice in Afghanistan, whether led by civil society organizations or national entities, as crucial components of a holistic justice and reconciliation process, ensuring that all aspects of the past are addressed. It urges the national processes examining the war in Afghanistan, such as the U.S. Afghanistan War Commission, to include questions on accountability in their investigations of the involvement of foreign military forces in Afghanistan for the past 20 years. It proposes conducting a comprehensive study utilizing an intersectional approach on the impact of decades of violent conflict on Afghan women and girls. This should include conflict analysis through a gender lens, including the lived experiences of Afghan women and girls, and investigation of sexual and gender-based crimes through various phases of the Afghan conflict. Thank you very much. These were some of the main, basically, issues that were discussed in the report. I'm sure other co-panelists would be covering in more detail other aspects, and I would be happy to take any question later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Said, for the comprehensive and precise introduction to this study. And before I move to the next speaker, I just make a small announcement that I forgot to make at the beginning, that taking photos are not allowed in this room except for the organizers, who will take the photo of the panel in the room from a wide angle. And if there is any objection to that, you can talk with my colleague Raoul at the entrance of the room. Our next speaker is Kobra. Ms. Kobra Muradi is an international law and human rights lawyer who previously worked on international criminal accountability at the Australian Centre for International Justice, Afghanistan Human Rights and Democracy Organization, UN Assistance to the Khmer Rouge Trials, and the Clooney Foundation for Justice. Kobra, could you please share your insights on the informal and transitional justice mechanisms available, and what key findings did the study reveal in this area? Thank you. Over to you for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Hamid. Before going into the tools that are available for Afghanistan, I just wanted to briefly touch upon why we need to look beyond formal top-down or judicial and criminal approaches to addressing past human rights abuses, past and present human rights abuses. While criminal trials are important, but because of their temporal and subject matter limitations and resource constraints, often international trials cannot comprehensively address the full scope of criminality and address the various types of harms that have been suffered, that victims have suffered, and to meet their various diverse needs and expectations. Also, international criminal trials are geographically remote, which make them physically inaccessible to victims. Often victim participation is limited. And also the complex language of rights and also procedures in international criminal trials make them inaccessible to many victims. Dr. Huma laid out the various types of human rights abuses that has been committed in Afghanistan, impacting hundreds of thousands of Afghan victims. And so this scope and spread of human rights violations in Afghanistan and violations of international humanitarian law spanning decades, involving variety abuses and criminality and multiple layers of harms require a comprehensive approach in incorporating retributive, restorative, top-down and bottom-up approaches to addressing past and present human rights violations. That is not to say that other mechanisms should replace criminal trials. Rather, they should complement criminal justice efforts or international criminal trials. And a point that I wanted to emphasize is that Afghan victims have in the past, and including in the countrywide consultation that was carried out by the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, they not only demanded criminal prosecutions, but also asked for acknowledgement, apology, truth-telling, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition. In terms of the tools, while there are various non-judicial or non-retributive tools that are available, I wanted to acknowledge the limitation of our report that we only highlight some of those tools, focusing on what options are strategically, what options can be pursued right now under the current circumstances. And one specific response that we highlight is reparations. Reparations involve a wide range of responses, including compensation, restitution, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition, and they can be provided both on an individual and collective basis. The benefits of reparations is that it's victim-centric. It focuses on addressing damages that have been suffered by victims, whether that's physical or mental injury, emotional suffering, property damage, and loss of profits. And as Dr. Huma highlighted, that in Afghanistan, economic crimes have taken place, including during the Republic. And also, the benefits of reparations is that it can help in repairing harms that victims have suffered, alleviate their pain, and provide a form of symbolic acknowledgement and dignify victims as bearers of human rights. In terms of avenues, there is the International Criminal Court, which presently has ongoing investigations in the case of Afghanistan, and the ICC can provide court-based reparation orders. However, that has to follow a conviction. And for Afghanistan at the moment, that's a distant prospect because an arrest warrant hasn't been issued, no one has been convicted. But something that Afghan civil society organizations and others interested in justice for Afghanistan should pursue is the Trust Fund for Victims Assistance Mandate. Which can provide physical, psychological, and material support to victims, and that does not require, it's not dependent on a conviction. And I recommend Afghan civil society to explore this option, is starting with a thorough assessment of how the Afghanistan situation meets this assistance mandate, and also why, and develop arguments as to why the situation of Afghanistan should be prioritized. Another mechanism for reparation is national compensation schemes, which Australia has implemented as of this year in July 2024. And this follows the findings of the Brereton inquiry, which found evidence of war crimes by Australian forces in Afghanistan, recommending criminal investigations, administrative action by the Australian government, as well as providing compensation to Afghan victims. And the National Compensation Scheme that has been established provides the possibility of providing letters of apology directly to victims and victims' families, and also monetary compensation. It has several limitations, which I will not go into. You can find some of the limitations that we have discussed in our report, but also I wanted to highlight that a statement by experts was issued following the compensation scheme, which included comments by Special Rapporteur Richard Bennett. And in terms of action, we in the report, we emphasize to the civil society that they should look into the possibility of other states who had international forces engaged in Afghanistan, whether they can also follow suit and implement a national compensation scheme. And also other mechanisms that we discuss in the reports are truth-seeking, documentation, oral history, archiving, memorialization. An example of that is the national inquiry that was conducted by Australia, which provide revelations. There is also a UK inquiry as well, and CSOs should also do some more advocacy, providing recommendations to other states to open similar inquiries in terms of documentation, supporting documentation efforts by UNSR Richard Bennett, UNAMA, and Afghan CSOs is really important. But there are several other actions Afghan civil society can take. And this includes information sharing, raising awareness. I think that's really important. And also conducting oral history, in particular with our elderly who do not have access to formal proceedings and do not have access to the language of rights. That way they can amplify their voices, and also preserving memory is really important. Another key mechanisms that we discuss is people tribunals. And people's tribunals are civil society-led action. They can investigate, conduct informal trials, and issue recommendations. There is a permanent people's tribunals that Afghan CSOs can request investigation from. But also Afghan and international CSOs can establish a people's tribunal specifically focusing on the situation of Afghanistan. But this would require a comprehensive analysis of what costs, resources are required, timeframes, and what added value a people's tribunal might provide given all other mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cobra, for precise sharing the findings of report on informal justice mechanisms on what civil society can do when they wait for the UN to take stronger action. Our next speaker is Mr. Richard Bennett, which needs no introduction to this room, at least. He has been at the forefront of the call and push for accountability and justice in Afghanistan for the last 3 years. And Richard, my question to you have some sub-questions. And I would want to start with how best to approach the topic of accountability in Afghanistan. And second, do you see any realistic prospects for domestic accountability under the Taliban current rule? And if not, what external accountability options should stakeholders invest or support? Should all of the available tools be pursued at the same time and with same weight? Or should some of them be prioritized and strategized? As you answer, please also feel free to refer to the report's features, especially how it highlights the historic background of the conflict and also the root causes. Thank you. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Mr. Formuli. And may I say how delighted I am to be a member of this panel and associated with the launch of this important report on accountability by the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. maybe as part of the answer to your first question, I'll introduce by saying that this week we've been talking quite a bit about accountability in Afghanistan and filling gaps. And at the beginning of the year at Raoul Wallenberg Institute, we thought that one of the gaps that would be useful along the way to fill would be to have a scholarly study which is written by Afghan scholars regarding the full background and panoply of accountability prospects in Afghanistan. So this is a scholarly contribution to the discussion about accountability in Afghanistan. It's a very substantive report, more than 50 pages. I strongly recommend that you read it, and I think it adds significantly to the existing literature on this matter. In particular, it takes a historical perspective. Not only does it lay out the historical context in Afghanistan, its various conflicts over more than 100 years, but particularly since 1979, it also looks at past accountability efforts and why they failed. And I think that by doing this, or unless this is done, unless previous attempts are learnt from, then Afghans and everyone else supporting them, if not aware of the past and not aware of the mistakes made, including in accountability endeavors, are very likely to make those mistakes again in future. In terms of the report itself, I think it's been very adequately described by Huma and Cobra already. So I don't plan to go into that in any great detail. Your second question was about realistic prospects for domestic accountability under Taliban rule. In fact, the report has a few pages on that. And it does set out what does exist, including decrees on ill treatment of detainees and on procedural rights. And it looks at the de facto institutions of accountability, which have been set up in 3 areas: complaints from the general public, against other members of the general public that are the responsibility of the Supreme Court, complaints from the general public against officials of the Islamic Emirate, which are the responsibility of the Ministry of Vice and Virtue, and complaints from Emirate employees against other Emirate officials, which are the responsibility of the military court. Now, this is pretty thin, but we have taken time, or those who drafted this report and researched it, to set out what exists. Clearly, it is vastly inadequate, and the prospects for strengthening that seem, at the moment, very limited. Anything is possible, but the signs are not particularly positive. And I think the third part of the question, and I can't see the time clock, didn't come up. Yeah, 2 minutes. Thank you. It's not. Oh, now it's come. Thanks. The third part of the question is about external accountability options that should be invested in or supported, and should they be given the same weight or prioritized. I've talked about an all tools approach, a comprehensive approach, as this report also sets out. The report doesn't suggest a sequencing. I think that there are some things that probably do need to be sequenced and others can be pursued simultaneously. For example, the International Criminal Court, the potential action in the International Court of Justice that's been discussed in this report and other events this week, and efforts to codify apartheid should, in my view, be pursued together at once. There wouldn't be any need to sequence them. I would also just want to note that documentation, including an investigation that details crimes and serious human rights violations in a detailed fashion and identifies perpetrators, is necessary. Documentation is the bedrock of all accountability. It must be bolstered, and hopefully my own mandate will be strengthened in this regard, and it will be ongoing. The report mainly discusses human rights accountability, but I want to finish off by talking about other forms of accountability, in particular political accountability. This includes a refusal to normalize the Taliban while they continue to commit atrocious human rights violations. And in particular, there must be demonstrated, measurable, and independently verified improvements against human rights benchmarks, particularly for women and girls. Therefore, any way forward should integrate human rights benchmarks through a principled, coordinated, and coherent approach, as proposed in the independent assessment requested by the Security Council and which led to Security Council Resolution 2721. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for your detailed insights and also for referring to the relevant parts in the report and highlighting them. Now I would like to turn to Mr. Tom Searing, who is a professor of law at Ohio Northern University and a visiting scholar at the University of Paris and Max Planck Institute, and also the chairman of the Human Rights Research League, who is the host of this event today. Tom, from your perspective, what are some key features of this study that distinguish it from similar reports, and how useful it could be for human rights activists and organizations who are working from within the country and abroad? And how can such studies be effectively used to support human rights advocacy work? Thank you. Over to you.
It's already on. Thank you, Hamid. I think that the starting point of what we're talking about when we talk about accountability, mostly we think about, at least people with my background, think about the legal issues and the universal jurisdiction issues, or jurisdictional ways of finding and seeking accountability. But alas, as we also have been seen and as pointed out in the report, justice, especially international justice, is never quick and necessarily selective. And if international tribunals or courts like the ICC will in the future at some point manage to have some of those perpetrators on trial, it will be a very minor number, and there will be hundreds of thousands that will probably not find their personal redress in such a trial. So what this report does, from my point of view, is, well, it doesn't reinvent the wheel, because there are, when it comes to accountability mechanisms on the international in an international forum or the jurisdictional issues, but it does so on the national level. It lays out whatever is available, even though it doesn't work out as of now, perhaps, or it has very limited impact within Afghanistan. And then, not least, it points out all options available on the international level, both jurisdictional, but also other ways, oral history, etc., of seeking and finding some form of accountability. And then also on the national level within other states, And that I find quite useful, because it's one thing that mechanisms exist, but here you have them all laid out in one report, and with a, to the degree possible, assessment of the pros and cons of each of that. Obviously, you cannot have the pros and cons of each effort within other countries, because then you would have to assess the situation separately every time, but that's a good starting point. So it's an encompassing, and in that sense, it's one of those all tools also by itself, all tools pointing out, all tools report. And I find that quite useful. I think if you treat it the right way, then organizations, individuals, whether they work on advocacy or focus more on research, it depends on their background, could use that as like a starting point, like a, say, one-stop shop, where you see what are the options available, and then you can read the parts that you know well, maybe quicker, others less so. So people, for example, with my background would probably jump or read roughly and quicker over the international jurisdictional aspects, but spend more time on, say, the historical background, which I found very useful. Also, when you think about, well, as has been said, no conflict really takes place in a vacuum. And to a certain extent, the ICC takes that into account, because they also have a mandate to start in 2003 for the conflict that has been going on in Afghanistan. But you point out in the report that technically it's been for many decades, even more than that. And I think the report starts somewhere around 1900, explaining also that, yeah, what might not be obvious to people who are not very familiar with the country, that even back then there were fractions that used to work together with foreigners in order to get an advantage, and others who worked more within the country, and they often opposed each other. And then, and I think that the report does a nice job here too, explaining that if you look at all the years that have passed, at some point there are almost no clear-cut only victims and only perpetrators. Some have probably been on both sides several times, perhaps. And the problem of that almost perpetual mutual cycle of impunity, and what that does to the country, and what it has done to limiting also the options of or raising the stakes of finding accountability and at some point perhaps peace. What is very useful in that report, I think, is when you look at all the options and you take your own background into account and find out where should you use your resources on and why, then you can take that as a starting point, because it's good to know, of course, not just what you are advocating for, but why. And here you can see then why would this maybe be more useful than something else. For instance, if you're a research-based or advocacy organization wanting to work within your own country, if it's not Afghanistan, then of course you can see, well, is it a country that has a useful and functioning universal jurisdiction or not? If so, then maybe you put your eggs in there. If not, then maybe you should use or look for other options. What I also found very useful is you talk, for example, about oral history, which wouldn't be the first thing I had in my mind because of, say, my background. But if you look at Afghanistan and look at the division of reading abilities, etc., a 2018 study said that 75% of Afghanistan are rural areas, and within the rural areas, you found in that year 63% of male and 90% of women who could neither read nor write. And when we say that the ICC, we complain that they don't have information or sufficient information in Dario Pashto, probably just in English and sometimes in French. Well, it wouldn't even help them. But with the approach of oral history, as one example, you might give them at least some feeling of being involved and having a stake in that part of accountability for the country. Yeah, so maybe I leave the other thoughts for later if we have time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your thoughtful evaluation and also for sticking to the time limit, which is very crucial given this 1 hour. Now I would like to open the floor for a few questions, and being mindful of the time left, please just state your name and affiliation and jump to the question. The floor is open, and also online participants, they can speak and they would be shown in the room. Who wants to break the ice? EU, Marlene?
And thank you also for the esteemed members of the panel for bringing the study to Geneva, in fact, because I think it's extremely interesting what you've written, and we'll make sure that our colleagues in Brussels are aware of this as well. Accountability matters. We know that accountability for past crimes has a preventive role as well for the future. It's not an easy topic, we know that too, and therefore I find it very interesting, in fact, that your report is bringing up avenues that maybe we haven't thought about previously. So this is worth looking into for us. We just had the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on Truth, Justice and Reparation this morning in the plenary here, and there again, the topic is there and needs to be tackled. Of course, in Afghanistan, the situation is extremely complicated. The many layers that come on top of this country situation are hard to count. But one of the issues that I did pick up on, because maybe some of it can be realized more quickly than others, was when you mentioned the trust fund for victim assistance. How would you see that in practice? Because I take it would be an international trust fund, or have you reflected on how something like that could maybe in the shorter term be operationalized? Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. We also have a question online from Dr. Said Shah. You please go ahead. Can you hear us, Dr. Said, on WebEx? Okay, apparently not. Maybe you can send your question in the chat and I would read it out to the speakers. And is there any question from the room? Yes.
First of all, I want to thank, this is Palvasha Mirvacha, I'm a fellow at the Royal Wallenberg Institute. I want to, first of all, thank the panelists and all the team in behind this very comprehensive report. My question in brief really requests to just seek the international mechanisms that are identified in the report, especially the UN and then the ICC. What are some of the challenges that are identified? How could some of those political and jurisdictional challenges could be overcome by practical steps that ensure accountability and in the decades of war that have happened in Afghanistan, the layers that are there, which we, you were very kind to lay out, but especially in case of situation where sometimes even perpetrators would line up as victims. That, in my view, becomes a very thorny matter, and it kind of goes beyond sequencing and prioritizing. So some views or some thoughts that you may have to elaborate on that point. And one last point, I want to also the question and could also come on to the systematic human rights violation that goes through these decades of conflict, especially in respect to women and girls under Taliban's rule. Any practical steps that can be taken by international actors to ensure accountability and potentially recognition of the gender appetite as a crime against humanity? So any prospects or light that have been shed on in this aspect, that would be appreciated as well.
Thank you very much. As time is limited, we will go to the answers. I think the first question was directly addressed to Ms. Moradi. She can start with the answer, and then Dr. Homa Saeed, and Richard and Tom can provide their insights on the other question. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Unfortunately, because of the limitations of the report, given that we have covered so many different tools, we don't really go into the specific details about how it might be operationalized. However, one of the key recommendations that we provide is that in international CSOs, as a first step, they should start with a thorough assessment of how it might apply to the Afghanistan situation. One thing about the trust fund assistance is that it's flexible and it doesn't require that a perpetrator has to be convicted. So it's something that can be started right now, and it focuses on providing physical, psychological, and material support, and it can be provided on an individual and collective basis. And one question actually that arises is it possible to extend that assistance mandate to victims who are now Afghan victims who are now in the diaspora? There are many who fled before August 2021, but many who were forced into displacement after August 2021. But it's that's a key recommendation, is to assess how it might be, how it might apply to the situation of Afghanistan, and how it can be, whether there are arguments to be made around prioritizing the situation of Afghanistan for that assistance mandate. Thank you.
Thank you, and Homa.
Yeah, thank you very much for
again.
that comprehensive question. I believe there were a series of questions, and I try to address briefly some of them as much as I can. I think the question in terms of challenges for accountability mechanisms outside Afghanistan, indeed, that is one of the issues that has been discussed with relative detail in the report. It addresses, for example, jurisdictional challenges, political challenges, logistical challenges, territorial challenges, temporal challenges, etc. I think these are facts on the ground that we need to acknowledge and try to work with as much as possible, how to overcome some, in terms of, for example, ICC's limitation with jurisdiction, or, for example, temporal limitation. For example, the ICC in the case of Afghanistan can only investigate crimes that have been committed as of May 2003, when Afghanistan joined the ICC. There is not much that can be done with that regard. However, a body like the ICC, I mean, some of the challenges that it can overcome, it could be enhanced by, for example, ensuring that the ICC has support from states towards its current investigation, ongoing investigation in the Afghanistan situation. The ICC, for example, could enhance its outreach towards Afghan victims and civil society organizations. That is often one of the issues that Afghan experts and researchers have pointed out. And this is actually one of the recommendations of the report as well. So I think that with some of the challenges, maybe in a limited way, it's possible to overcome them. And of course, then with regard to other institutions like under universal jurisdiction, or cases at the domestic level, investigation of cases at domestic level, for example, what is happening in Australia, with regard to some war crimes in Afghanistan. Obviously, we need political will by states to conduct such investigations. With regard to gender apartheid, recognition of gender apartheid, the report does discuss that, obviously not with as much detail, but it acknowledges the fact that there has been efforts by both Afghan and international experts and activists to codify gender apartheid in the proposed Crime Against Humanity Treaty. And this effort, this campaign is being taken forward. However, as we know, with the codification of any crime and international law, it will take time, because we need the states to agree to that proposition. We need the agreement of civil society, etc. Therefore, in the report, we also discuss, and as Richard pointed out, the approach here is really the all tools approach towards crimes in general, but specifically towards gender-based crimes, where we discuss all the possibilities, including, for example, gender persecution under the ICC, which currently does exist. I mean, as a legal tool, gender persecution does exist. We discussed the ICJ, that is another bringing case under CEDAW at the ICJ. That's another effort that is ongoing, as well as recognition of gender persecution as a ground for humanitarian protection. I believe that this is one of the areas that is slightly underexplored, even I would say perhaps among the international community experts, but UNHCR actually has done quite some important work on how gender persecution could provide a ground for protection in humanitarian visa, etc. And that's one of the areas where many Afghan women and girls could potentially benefit. I would leave it at that, and I'm sure other co-panelists will have other points to mention. Thank you.
Thank you. On the question about overcoming challenges, I fully agree with the previous speakers, including supporting the ICC and enhancing outreach to Afghan victims and survivors. Pawasha mentioned how victims become perpetrators and vice versa, and this is easy to overlook. And it's a feature of not one war, but multiple wars over decades. And I was struck by one quote from one of the people consulted for this report, one of the Afghans. I'll read it. "I think we've been conditioned to think of only one group as the enemy, and only one group or groups as victims. I think we have to get over this mentality and acknowledge that almost no one was safe from suffering and abuse since the late 1970s in Afghanistan." So this cycle of being a victim and a perpetrator and becoming a perpetrator and vice versa really needs to be addressed. I want to just point out in terms of practical steps, two things that are mentioned in the report. There has been quite a lot done already on documentation in Afghanistan, and it's not in plain sight, it's hidden. And there are two recommendations in this report. One is that the UN should make public the 2005 OHCHR mapping report of pre-2002 human rights abuses. This report includes information about perpetrators, the conditions and causes of the violations, and their impact on affected populations. Its release is important for shedding light on past abuses, promoting transparency and validating and recognizing the experiences of victims. It's 20 years ago, almost 20 years, still not public. Time it was. Secondly, there's another report that was produced by the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, also a mapping report. And similarly, the RWI report calls for that report to be made published, to be explored, at least the publication be explored. And this report documents alleged crimes committed between 1978 and 2001, building on the Call for Justice report that was mentioned before. And it also likely includes information about perpetrators and conditions and causes, etc. And finally, on gender apartheid, one very practical thing I'd recommend to RWI is to share this report with the members of the Sixth Committee in New York who are considering the potential treaty on crimes against humanity. Thank you.
Tom, over to you.
Well, Well, I agree with what has been said before, so I don't have to repeat that. Perhaps one more word only on that cycle of impunity that obviously has continued for decades, and that people are both perpetrators within the course of time and victims, and then perhaps perpetrators again. And it reminded me of, I think you had one case from the Munich High Court in your study. For some reason, you didn't have the final judgment there because it eventually was from the Federal Court of Justice also. And that judgment came just a couple of months before the Taliban took over. And in that judgment, a Afghan member of the armed forces was actually convicted of torture against a Taliban member. And in that, also the timing was interesting, to use that word, but also just underlines how those conflicts go back and forth if you don't find justice in any of those. And what I think we could do on a national level is, since it's easier to have national trials, a little bit easier than the international trials, probably focus also on, where possible, more of the universal jurisdiction trials, and then, not least, spread the word that both sides, to the degree they are, have been convicted. Because I'm not sure how much, for example, that judgment is known in Afghanistan. Then maybe others might be more forthcoming also for getting the other side convicted, if they see that it's actually a balanced justice, as justice should be.
Thank you very much, Tom. And as we wrap up, I want to extend my gratitude to all of you for your insights today, and also for your continued work on accountability. And also I want to thank the audience for their thoughtful and very careful listening and participation. This conversation was just one part of the ongoing effort to ensure that the paths to accountability and justice is not blocked, even in the most challenging circumstances. I encourage everyone and diplomats, especially in the room, to read the report. It's already available on the website of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, and to send it also to your colleagues at Afghanistan desk and also the NGOs in the room. I've been a diplomat here in a 1 month long heavy session. Some of you might get scared by the 50-something page report and close it immediately. And so don't worry, we also prepared the executive summary of the report and also the key recommendations that you can read separately now when the session is going on. With that, I thank you all, and I wish you a nice rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.